Moses Mendelssohn was really a trailblazer. He played a pivotal role in the emergence of modern Judaism. A leading figure of the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah. In his own day, Mendelssohn was one of the most famous Enlightenment philosophers throughout Europe. And he's also been seen as the first modern Jewish philosopher, and as David mentioned, even the first modern Jew. But when you look at the reception of Moses Mendelssohn, especially over the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, he was often regarded more as someone whose significance belonged to the past rather than to the present or the future. Already with Hegel in the beginning of the 19th century, philosophers charged that Moses Mendelssohn's philosophy was superficial, unoriginal. Marxists rejected his commitment to capitalism as out of date, flying in the face of the truths of historical materialism. Many Zionists criticized Mendelssohn, believing that he had exchanged a robust sense of Jewish nationalism for an illusory dream of assimilation. And this claim was made in the 19th century and then was seen to have been definitively proven after the Holocaust by many Zionists. Many Orthodox Jews, on the other hand, saw Mendelssohn as the father of secularism and reform. For their part, secular Jews often thought that Moses Mendelssohn's belief in religion and religious principles made him too religious, while many Reform Jews thought that his commitment to halakha made him too orthodox. For many conservative Jews, Mendelssohn was insufficiently attuned to historical change. He lacked a robust sense of historical development. While renewal Jews thought that Mendelssohn's Judaism was too coldly rational and inattentive to personal religious experience. But something interesting has happened, which is that while Mendelssohn was a very important figure in the 19th century, and then kind of fell out of fashion, especially at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, suddenly, in the 21st century, Mendelssohn seems to be, to many people, relevant again. And there are a plethora of academic studies, tens of books, articles, and translations of Mendelssohn's works that have been coming out mostly in the last 20 years. And that's really remarkable. And this book, which I edited with Chip Mannequin, was born of a sense that there's something very important that Mendelssohn has to tell us about this particular moment in history. And this volume gathers many of the leading Mendelssohn scholars to think about questions of contemporary relevance like religion, politics, and nationalism. Well, why is Mendelssohn relevant today? Part of it has to do with the world in which Mendelssohn came into maturity. Yeah. Mendelssohn's age was an age of radical change. He was living in a world that was undergoing enormous upheaval. Principles of the Enlightenment were transforming the social, political, and religious spheres. Ideals of universal reason were challenging entrenched dogmas of Christianity, while ideals of equality and tolerance were calling into question long-established social and economic privileges for European Christians. Now, Judaism clearly had much to gain from these Enlightenment principles. Dethroning the supremacy of Christian belief opened the door to Judaism being deemed a religious confession equal to Protestantism and Catholicism. Equality and tolerance opened the possibility of Jews being granted civil rights and entering economic professions that had previously excluded them. But, not surprisingly, many German Protestants felt deep anxiety about these developments, about this changing world. And many of them reacted by blaming Jews for these changes. It was very common for many German Christians and Protestants to stereotype Jews as beggars, shysters, or thieves. Protestants, it was argued that if Jews were granted more equal rights, that would increase crime and impoverish society. As Jews sought to enter more professions, many Protestants worried that Jews would steal their jobs, and they argued that the government must act to protect them, to protect Christians. Jews were also commonly accused of sowing social division and disorder, chaos. It was often claimed that Jews regarded themselves as superior to Christians. They secretly maintained very hateful attitudes towards Christians. They did not regard the countries in which they lived as their homelands. And they felt free to disregard the local laws if it was in their interest and they thought they could get away with it. For many German Protestants, the fact that Jews seemed to commit and stated that many Jews were committing to liberal enlightenment was itself a cynical ploy that was used simply to advance their own economic interests. And one could see, it was argued, that the Jews weren't really committed to Enlightenment principles because of their fanatical loyalty to their rabbis, the disdain for secular learning, and their belief in the legitimacy of using political power, such as excommunication, to enforce halachic law. As a result, many Protestants argued that Jews had no place in a modern enlightened polity. Indeed, some conclude that the only way that Jews could attain equal rights was by abandoning Judaism and becoming Christians. Others thought that even this would not suffice. Judaism was so penetrated the veins of Jews, it was so in their blood, that they could never be accepted as equals. How did Mendelssohn? Mendelssohn stepped into this environment, and he sought to meet these challenges. And I would argue that he adopted a three-pronged approach that is very worth considering in our own day. First, Mendelssohn believed that it was important to enact internal changes within German Judaism. He recognized that the critics of Judaism were not entirely wrong. Many German Jews were highly suspicious of secular knowledge. Many did maintain superstitious beliefs. Many believed that the rabbi should have the power to excommunicate and harbored hateful attitudes towards Christians. Some Jews were involved in crime and felt that it was legitimate to defraud Christians. Mendelssohn taught that this was a defacing of true Judaism, that true Judaism was fully compatible with enlightened cosmopolitan ideals. As evidence of this, Mendelssohn noted that unlike Protestantism, Judaism did not demand belief in irrational dogmas of faith. And the Talmud, he argued, was a book committed to logical reasoning. Judaism was more tolerant than Protestantism, affirming that one need not be Jewish to go to heaven. Halacha commanded Jews to be loyal to the countries in which they resided, to obey its laws, and to regard their fellow non-Jewish inhabitants as brothers and sisters. And this was not just a set of theoretical philosophical beliefs for Mendelssohn. He sought to take practical action to change the way Judaism was perceived by Jews, by reforming Jewish education. So that's the first element, which was a sense that there's need for some internal change in the community. Second, Mendelssohn sought to define what it meant to be German. In the 18th century, there was actually no accepted definition of what it meant to be German. Germany was divided into all sorts of, there was no Germany, there were just different polities, German states, and there was a lot of people debated and had questions about what does it really mean to be German. For Mendelssohn, being German clearly was not a question of blood or religion. There were Catholic and Protestant Germans, and Prussia, the German state in which Mendelssohn resided, had welcomed immigrants of different religions from different lands. For Mendelssohn, he argued that German culture must be defined by what the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz had called the grand manner of philosophizing. And Leibniz, who lived before Mendelssohn, had argued that truth could only be attained by welcoming many different perspectives, by looking for different sources of truth and finding the truth in each individual perspective. And Mendelssohn's commitment to this principle is evident in his lifelong commitment to the process of translation. Mendelssohn is very well known for his translation of the Bible into German, which was the first German Jewish Bible translation. But it's less known that he also introduced Plato into German discourse, translating him from Greek into German. He translated Jean-Jacques Rousseau from French into German, and the important English philosopher Lord Shaftesbury from English into German. So he was translating, constantly involved in a process of translation because he believed this was critical for society to move forward, to be revitalized, for progress. So that's the second principle. He sought to define German identity. The third principle, and the third thing that Mendelssohn did, was that he believed and argued very strongly that Judaism was of a value not just for Jews, but for German society as a whole. For Mendelssohn, Judaism provided a model for marrying rational Enlightenment philosophy with religious faith. The foundation of Judaism was law, whose goal was to perfect a person's mind and ethical character. Judaism was a tolerant religion, which found value in multiple religious expressions. Mendelssohn saw Judaism's principles as helping temper religious division and as providing a foundation for social cohesion. For this reason, he believed that being a good Jew was not just or even primarily about benefiting the Jewish people, but rather about benefiting German society as a whole. And this was how he understood the prophet Isaiah's injunction to the Jews to be a light unto the nations. The anxieties that many German Protestants felt in the 18th century seem strikingly similar to the anxiety that many white Americans and Europeans feel today. Now as then, there is resentment about foreigners stealing one's jobs, impoverishing the country, bringing crime, sowing social disorder, and being insufficiently patriotic. And as in the 18th century, there is a temptation to long for an idyllic, imagined past when society was supposedly more homogeneous, peaceful, and prosperous. Mendelssohn understood that such views were toxic fantasies and would lead society to become more violent, bigoted, and poorer. And he saw in enlightened cosmopolitanism a model for looking forward rather than backwards. His key insight was that implementing enlightened cosmopolitanism required reforms and adjustments on all sides. Majorities who felt dispossessed must learn that hatred and outrage were not signs of moral courage and strength. Rather, they were signs of fear and weakness. And this is what Mendelssohn wrote in his 1783 masterpiece, Jerusalem. Quote, "It requires some reflection if we are to comprehend that hatred and vindictiveness, envy and cruelty are at bottom nothing but weakness and merely the effects of fear." For Mendelssohn, welcoming the stranger and allowing her to preserve religious and cultural difference was not just a question of moral duty, but also of enlightened self-interest, since it was a way of vitalizing a country's economy and culture by injecting fresh ideas and energy. So that's on the part of majorities. For their part, minorities should strive to value humanistic learning, cherish the countries they live in, learn the local language, and regard all the country's citizens as their brothers and sisters while remaining faithful to their own religion. And as Mendelssohn put it, adapt yourselves to the morals and constitution of the land to which you have been removed, but hold fast to the religion of your fathers. Bear both burdens as well as you can. So at a time of much social anxiety in 21st century America, I believe that we can still learn much from the profound insights of a great German Jewish philosopher of the 18th century. I look forward to David Sorkin's comments and to the conversation. So I'll turn it over to David.
I'd like to talk about Moses Mendelssohn's relevance today, and I'd like to do so by suggesting that the very characteristics which made him the most formative figure for Judaism in the 19th century, make him a relevant figure today. Now, David Myers called me the Dean of German Jewish Studies, which makes me a bit uncomfortable because I want to talk about the person I consider to be the Dean of Mendelssohn Studies, which is the late Alexander Altman. In 1983, at a conference which I had the pleasure to attend, and Ismar Schorsch was also there and gave a wonderful paper, Alexander Altman gave a fabulous paper on Moses Mendelssohn as the archetypal German Jew, in which he argued that Mendelssohn had been the patron saint of German Jewry. And he singled out 4 characteristics which had given Mendelssohn that prominent position. First, acculturation, his masterful adoption of German language and culture, including his friendship with Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. Second, that he was a Jew by conviction, not just by birth. Third, that he was the first philosopher of Judaism in modern times. And finally, and particularly in his defense of the commandments, of the mitzvot. And finally, that he was an unflagging advocate for the Jews' civil rights or emancipation. Now, whereas Michah emphasized Mendelssohn's critics in the 19th century, I'm going to emphasize his admirers. Because one could say that because of those 4 characteristics, Mendelssohn was in fact the most formative figure, indeed the patron saint of all the various forms of German Judaism which emerged in the 19th century. Reform Jews could hold on to Mendelssohn's emphasis on morality and reason in Judaism. And that became then the core of the notion, Geiger's notion of prophetic Judaism, for example. Conservative Jews in the 19th century, known as positive historical Jews, could admire Mendelssohn's very deft effort to balance between reason and the commandments. And Orthodox Jews could emphasize Mendelssohn's own observance and the fact that Mendelssohn identified the commandments, observance of the commandments, the mitzvot, with morality for Judaism. So all of the various forms of Judaism, and what we today see as the streams of Judaism or the denominations, emerged in Germany in the 19th century, and all of them could claim Mendelssohn as their patron saint or father. In addition, it shouldn't be forgotten that Mendelssohn was also the author of one of the best-selling Hebrew books of the 19th century. His translation of the Bible and commentary went through at least 24 editions in the 19th century. And those editions, those weren't put out by academic presses, those were put out by commercial presses because the publishers knew that they would be lucrative. Now, what's important to see is that those books also transformed Mendelssohn's project. Because the first edition of Mendelssohn's Bible, the Book of the Paths of Peace, Sefer Netivot HaShalom, only had a few pieces. It had the biblical text in Hebrew, of course. It had Mendelssohn's translation into German, though, and I can't emphasize strongly enough, printed in Hebrew letters, German in Hebrew letters, and then Mendelssohn's commentary in Hebrew as well. Subsequent editions turned Mendelssohn's Bible into the study Bible of the 19th century. What was added to it? Rashi's commentary, the source for teaching the Bible to children and the source of the most accessible and vivid source of rabbinic commentary. The Aramaic translation of Onkelos was added, which is considered to be authoritative by the rabbis. Many editions carried the Sabbath liturgy and the Haftorah portions. so that it could be used for study and liturgical purposes. So Mendelssohn's Bible became the study Bible of the 19th century, and one of the best-selling Hebrew books. Now, how do these characteristics, which I've mentioned that Altman identified, the 4 characteristics of acculturation, of Jew by conviction, the first philosopher of Judaism in modern times, and an advocate of civil rights or emancipation, translate into relevance in the 21st century? Let me just give you a few examples. First, on the reconciliation of belief and philosophy, I'd like to briefly discuss a wonderful, revealing piece by the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who teaches at the University of Chicago, is a very well-known political philosopher and student of classical philosophy, published an article about her conversion to Judaism, which she called Judaism and the Love of Reason. And in the first sentence of that article, she says, "I am an Enlightenment Jew." Now, what does she mean by that? What she means by that is that she converted to a Judaism as she understood it, quote, committed to the primacy of the moral, the authority of truth and reason, and the equal worth of all human beings. And she has a couple of quotations at the beginning of the article. Who do they come from? Moses Mendelssohn. I quote, "The highest stage of wisdom is incontrovertibly doing that which is good." Moses Mendelssohn, 1777. Or a famous slogan of Mendelssohn's, "Love truth, love peace," 1783. Now, she also says that the Orthodox rabbi who converted her, in her eyes, was a Mendelssohnian, even though he didn't know it. She says he believed in the priority of the practical, and he understood the biblical revelation as legislation that demanded performance rather than as metaphysical dogma. And then she quotes Mendelssohn. I quote, "Among all the prescriptions and ordinances of the Mosaic law, there is not a single one which says, 'You shall believe or not believe.' They all say, 'You shall do or not do.' Faith is not commanded, for it accepts no other commands than those that come to it by way of conviction. All the commandments of the divine law are addressed to man's will, to his power to act." Now, the second example I'd like to cite is one which one of my sons brought to my attention. It's an article that appeared in the New York Times, in the International New York Times, by one Mustafa Aykyol, called "Sharia's Winding Path into Modernity." It appeared in July 4th, 2017. The question that the author raises is, how does one reconcile Islamic law, Sharia, and religious liberty? How do you reconcile a religion based in law with a liberal society governed by civil law? And what's his answer? He says what we need to look at is, quote, "the Jewish Enlightenment. Its proponents," here I quote, "like the 18th century philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, reinterpreted Judaism in the light of modern values like secular knowledge, rationality, and freedom of conscience. The arguments Mendelssohn articulated in his 1783 masterpiece, Jerusalem, are remarkably similar to the arguments by Muslim reformists today. In other words, the Jewish Enlightenment, not Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation, is the right analogy for the reform needed in contemporary Islam." A third example, and this is the third issue, is that of immigration and refugees. Michah raised this already. Mendelssohn, because of his intellectual prominence in the 18th century, was asked at different times by various Jewish communities to intercede on their behalf when they were having difficulties with the authorities. One example of that was the community of Dresden, which was about to be expelled because its charter had expired. And here's what Mendelssohn wrote about expulsion. And I think, though this was about Jews, it applies to any refugee or immigrant today. Expulsion is for a Jew the harshest punishment. More than mere banishment, it is virtual extirpation from God's earth, for prejudice turns him away at every border with an iron fist. Must fellow human beings who are free of guilt and trespass suffer this harshest of punishments simply because they adhere to different principles of belief and through misfortune are reduced to poverty? Finally, the last issue I'd like to address is that of individual freedom. And Michah already mentioned this, that Mendelssohn was an advocate of a form of radical individualism and of the reduction of religious authority. He rejected coercion of any kind in any religion. He saw religion as necessarily being a voluntary society in which any member, anyone who wants to participate or belong, should be allowed to do so. Let me just read you a quotation from Mendelssohn. "The purpose of an ecclesiastical society, a church or a synagogue, is collective edification, participation in the effusion of the heart, through which we acknowledge our gratitude for God's benefactions and our filial trust in his infinite beneficence. In what spirit would we want to deny entrance to the dissident, nonconformist, errant, or recusant to refuse the freedom to partake of this edification? Reason's house of devotion requires no locked doors." And then, in addition, he says, "The true divine religion arrogates to itself no authority over opinions, and judgments, recognizes no power other than the power of argument to convince and to persuade, and through conviction to bestow felicity. The true divine religion has recourse to neither arms nor fingers. It is pure spirit and heart." Thank you.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. So you've both made arguments, complementary arguments for Mendelssohn's present-day 21st century relevance. But before we get to that, Mendelssohn was an extraordinary human figure. He had an extraordinary life. He was called both, I think, the Socrates of Berlin and also the improbably circumcised philosopher. And so this extraordinary Jewish life we should evoke before we move to the more abstract issues, I think. You've given us, David, a wonderful picture or sense of Mendelssohn's own words, and he was a great, elegant writer. But maybe you could just give us a sketch of his life, and we'll pick up from there.
Thank you, Abe. Can everyone hear now? Okay. The way I think of Mendelssohn is I think of the two faces of Moses Mendelssohn. One is Moses Mendelssohn, the German philosopher, who was known as the Socrates of Berlin. The other is Moses Mendelssohn, the Jewish writer writing in Hebrew, who was known as Moses Dessau, Moshe Dessau, and about whom it was said, "From Moses unto Moses there was none like Moses," from the biblical Moses to Maimonides to Mendelssohn. Let me just give you a brief account of the two faces of Mendelssohn. Let me begin with Moses of Dessau, Moshe Dessau, the Hebrew writer and Jewish thinker. Mendelssohn was born in 1729 in Dessau to a learned but impoverished Jewish family. His father was a scribe. He had a traditional cheder education until the age of 13, until his bar mitzvah, with a very learned rabbi, who then was called to a more prestigious post in Berlin. And Mendelssohn followed his rabbi, David Frankel, to Berlin, where he became a student at Berlin's yeshiva, which was known as the Yeshiva of 40 Students, because it supposedly had fellowships or support for 40 students. What that support meant is that you took meals with wealthy families in Berlin. You would pray at private synagogues for a small remuneration. Mendelssohn wrote that in those early years in Berlin, he often had a loaf of bread to eat for the entire week, and he would make marks in the bread so he would know how much he could eat each day. While at the yeshiva, he studied Talmud and other Jewish texts vigorously. As a youngster in Dessau, he had already gone beyond what was then the standard curriculum of Talmud and Kabbalah, and had started studying the Bible on his own, memorizing Psalms, writing poetry in Hebrew, and he continued in those activities. He then wrote in Hebrew continuously throughout his life, which is something that's often neglected. In the late 1750s, he published the first modern journal in Hebrew. It only came out in 2 issues, but nonetheless. In 1760, he published a commentary on a philosophical primer of Moses Maimonides from the 12th century, which he updated for contemporary use. In 1770, a commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes, which gave him the occasion to discuss philosophical issues through exegesis. And then in 1783, his Bible translation, which was really his magnum opus, which I mentioned, and which then became the best-selling Hebrew book one of the best-selling Hebrew books of the 19th century. So much for Moses Dessau. Now the Socrates of Berlin. While Mendelssohn was in Berlin studying at the yeshiva, he also began secular studies. There were a number of people who tutored him at the time, Jewish intellectuals from Eastern Europe, who introduced him to medieval Jewish philosophy and commenting on medieval Jewish philosophy. He also began to study languages. In those days, you didn't go to Berlitz in order to study language or even pick up a dictionary. He would read the Bible in Hebrew and read the Bible in the other language in order to teach himself that language. He taught himself English, French, and of course German, and became a master of German prose, and also Greek and Latin. He published his first book in 1754, The Philosophical Dialogues, which is a wonderful story. He had become very good friends with Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, one of Germany's great men of letters in the late 18th century. They played chess together. And Mendelssohn wrote a book, and one day gave it to Lessing, wrote a manuscript and wrote it to Lessing and said, well, would you have a look at this and tell me what you think, and let me know if the German is any good and what I should do with it. And they kept playing chess, meeting regularly, time passed, and after a few months, Mendelssohn said to Lessing, well, have you had a chance to look at my manuscript? And Lessing reached into his briefcase and pulled out a published book and said, here it is. And so that was Mendelssohn's first publication. He continued to publish regularly. His books were well known, but one of the things that helped to make his reputation is that he was also a consummate reviewer of books. He wrote for a journal that was published by a good friend of his, Friedrich Nicolai. Lessing, Nicolai, and Mendelssohn were sort of a triumvirate. And basically, it was the equivalent of the New York Review of Books, not the Jewish Review of Books, of his day. And he wrote over, I think, between 80 and 100 reviews. And this gave him a reputation throughout German-speaking Europe. There were two other things that made his reputation. In 1763, the Royal Berlin Academy of Sciences had an essay contest. Mendelssohn wrote a philosophical treatise called Treatise on Certainty and Metaphysical Philosophy, and he won first place in that essay contest. Immanuel Kant, have any of you heard of Immanuel Kant? Kant won second place. In 1767, as Michah said, Mendelssohn translated works from various languages, Rousseau from French, Shaftesbury from English, Plato from Greek. He translated Plato's dialogue, the Phaedon on the immortality of the soul, in which he also rewrote. And that book became an international bestseller, and it turned Mendelssohn into the Socrates of Berlin. To the point where Mendelssohn was on the intellectual tourist circuit. You know, if you were a young gentleman from England or from France or from Italy making the grand tour as part of your education, and you went to Prussia and you came to Berlin, one of the places you had to go was to meet Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn kept an open salon at his home in the late afternoon, and people also came to visit him at the silk factory, of which he was at first a bookkeeper, eventually became a manager, and ultimately a co-owner. So he was both then, he had these two faces, Moses of Dessau and the Socrates of Berlin.
So, let's see. Let's pick up on it this way. So, Michah, you've argued for Mendelssohn's contemporary relevance. David's just sketched his biography. Is there a particular moment in that biography, whether David has mentioned it or not, that exemplifies his present-day relevance, the way in which he could speak to us, be a usable figure?
Well, I wanted to mention an event that David didn't get to, which is famous controversy that he had. And he had many controversies in his life. People have this image of Mendelssohn as this very mild-mannered person, and he was, although he wrote in certain places that was not his personality, he actually had a very fiery temperament, and he had to control it, and he found a way to really be in control of himself, and he was very self-possessed. But there's when he wrote this Phaedon, and I'd also add to David's wonderful summary that actually Mendelssohn was the person who, in many ways, introduced Plato into Germany, and his work, the Phaedon, was very significant in reviving interest in Plato in Prussia, in German-speaking lands. So, he wrote this work, and this work was, as was mentioned, an international bestseller. Went into 4 editions in his lifetime. Was translated into 5 languages. He was getting invitation to all sorts of royal courts, and this work was a defense of the immortality of the soul. And one person who read this was the Swiss deacon by the name of Johann Caspar Lavater. And Lavater was a great admirer of Moses Mendelssohn and was familiar with his works. And Lavater, though, he was on the one hand an admirer of philosophy and someone who kind of kept up with Enlightenment thought and in some sense identified with it, but then he had this other side of himself where he was this kind of mystic, and he had these millenarian messianic fantasies. And this was something which, these two things going together was not necessarily something so unusual in the 18th century. If you think about someone like Newton, who is, on the one hand, discovering modern physics, the principles of modern physics, but had spent much of his time writing commentaries on biblical prophecies. So this was not necessarily unusual for the time. But Lavater, he was operating with some of the stereotypes that I had mentioned before, and he assumed that a person who was rational and a person who is ethical, by definition, must be a Christian. A person who was irrational, right, shunned secular knowledge, who had the stupidity not to realize that the New Testament was the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and was unethical and immoral, that was a Jew. So he looked at Moses Mendelssohn, and he was very confused. On the one hand, this is a highly rational, intellectual, moral person, and he's highly ethical. Mendelssohn was very well known for being extremely ethical. On the other hand, he's an active member of the Jewish community. Publicly, he's clearly identifies as a Jew, and he's someone who is giving sermons in the great synagogue in Berlin, was friends with the chief rabbi, and so forth. So he's kind of had a brain freeze about this. It kind of really, he didn't know what to do with this, Lavater. So he came to the conclusion that you can't have a logical contradiction. So the conclusion must be not that his stereotypes are wrong, but that Mendelssohn was secretly a Christian at heart, and that he was doing these things just to protect himself, and he didn't really believe in Judaism. So Lavater then decided that he wanted to call Mendelssohn out, because he thought Mendelssohn is so respected by the Jewish community that if he would actually confess his true belief in Jesus and in Christianity, he would inspire all these Jews, so many Jews, to convert to Christianity, and this would kind of spread like a wildfire and would precipitate the second coming of Christ. So there were quite serious consequences to this in his mind. So he hit upon this idea. He read this book by a Swiss physician, physiologist, scientist, Charles Bonnet, who was very well respected, who had written a defense of Christianity, a philosophical defense of Christianity. And what Lavater did was he decided to translate part of it and to dedicate it to Mendelssohn. And what he dedicated it in a very interesting way. He dedicated to what he called, to Mendelssohn, who he called an Israelite in whom there is no guile. Guile, deceit, no deceit. And he said that Mendelssohn should consider these arguments by Bonnet and refute them if he could, and if he could not, he should, quote, do what prudence, love of truth, and honesty command you to do, what Socrates would have done had he read this work and found it irrefutable. In other words, he's saying if you find these defenses of Christianity to be irrefutable, you should convert to Christianity. And this calling Mendelssohn an Israelite in whom there is no deceit was very important, because it's actually a reference to the New Testament, to the first chapter of John, where Jesus encounters someone named Nathanael, an Israelite, and he calls Nathanael an Israelite in whom there is no guile, an honest Israelite. Well, how could that be? Well, the answer is Nathanael then proceeds to call Jesus the Son of God and admit that Jesus is the Son of God. So he expected Mendelssohn to follow in this path. And so this put Mendelssohn in really an impossible situation, because on the one hand, he was just a tolerated Jew. I mean, Mendelssohn was not a citizen. Almost no Jews were citizens. Only the most wealthy could be citizens. He was a tolerated Jew. And his position was very precarious, and it was very problematic for him to challenge the prevailing religious system of Protestantism. So he really didn't know what to do, because on the one hand, he couldn't really attack Christianity publicly and explain why he thought these arguments were no good. But on the other hand, if he said nothing, that would be taken as evidence that he really agreed with these arguments and that Christianity was the true religion. So he kind of debated this for a couple of months, and then he hit upon a truly brilliant solution. And he wrote this essay came to be known as the Open Letter to Lavater. And this is one of his most amazing works. And this was a work which really, in some ways, was very difficult for him because it shocked him. David has mentioned that he was active in the Jewish community writing Hebrew works, writing German philosophical works. But in his German philosophical works and his Jewish works were almost two separate worlds. They didn't really interact with each other. He never had to explain his commitment in German, his commitment to Judaism, to a German Protestant audience. He felt it wasn't necessary. He thought, we're beyond that. We're tolerant, enlightened people. And he realized with Lavater that that was not true. So he had to do this. But how to do this? So his solution was, he really had kind of three parts in the essay. First, he was extremely honest. He said, look, you've put me, Lavater, in an impossible situation. What am I supposed to do? This is extremely embarrassing. If I publicly criticize Christianity, then, I'm going to kind of take it on the chin. So he first explained the situation so everyone could understand it. The second thing was he says, how little do you think of me, Lavater? You think I'm so silly that I've never considered the foundations of my religion and I just accept it out of fear? He said it would be much easier for me to convert. If I converted, I would get all sorts of social privileges. You think it's easy to be a Jew who's tolerated, barely tolerated, and has to face anti-Semitism and that wasn't the term then, but hatred against Jews, and this is not a conviction I take lightly. It's something that is a deep conviction for me that I've thought very carefully about it. And then what he did was in the third part, which was the most important thing that he did, was that he said that he talked about why he adhered to Judaism, and he said that Judaism was a religion that didn't believe that you had to be Jewish to go to heaven. If you were an ethical person, and he cited these 7 Noahide laws, if you were an ethical person, you could go to heaven. Judaism didn't seek to make converts. And this was so brilliant because he didn't have to say anything about Christianity. What he was leaving unsaid, but that all Christians knew, was they believed that unless you believe in Jesus' incarnation and resurrection and the Trinity, that you were going to hell. And he was saying Judaism is actually much more progressive than Christianity, and Judaism fits much better with Enlightenment principles than Christianity. And in fact, what he was saying was that it's not that a Jew should convert to Christianity, it's that Christians should be making Christianity more like Judaism. And that was, again, this element of his thought where he's trying to instruct and improve society and improve the wider world. And he was not only concerned, again, just with the Jewish world. So the reaction to this was amazing because most Christian intellectuals, Protestant intellectuals who observed this sided with Mendelssohn. And that was incredible, that most of them thought that Lavater was completely out of line, and in fact Lavater was kind of forced to apologize, which he kind of sort of did. But that was a very important symbol, I think, for many Jews to realize that these Christians who had all this power could see that a Jew was right. And that a Christian was treating them unethically by asking them to convert, which previously had been seen that's the best thing for a Jew would be to convert. So this is actually a very important, resonant episode in his life that I think illustrates some of the issues that he was tackling with and his ways of showing a way forward.
Do you want to jump in, David, or I? Let me push you for a minute. I understand how it shows the issues that he was dealing with, those specific issues of the 1770s. But you were, in your initial talk, you were arguing for a Mendelssohn who can show us how to respond to our issues. So how are we going to translate that very particular late 18th century European situation to our, let's say, Trumpian moment?
So my sense of it is that Mendelssohn is providing a model for how a minority, especially a minority religion, finds its place in society in the context of a majority. Of a different religious and cultural affiliation. And I think that what one finds just in this letter is already Mendelssohn is defining Judaism as a religion that is in accordance with tolerance. Even though one can find many thinkers and writers who said very intolerant things, Mendelssohn's argument was this is a distortion of true Judaism. And he would always go back to certain original, especially Talmudic sources and certain authoritative commentators to prove this, although he was willing to disagree with someone like Maimonides on Maimonides' interpretation of the Noahide laws, which he thought was too exclusivistic. So he believed that there was an authentic core of Judaism, and he was willing to work to establish that. And he felt that this core was something that was in accordance with tolerance, reason, and life in a broader society. And secondly, and the second point is the point that I mentioned, that he felt that it wasn't only a responsibility of Jews to adjust and rethink their religion, or just to kind of find their place in society. They had to work for the betterment of society as a whole. And their religion had to be important not just for preserving Jews, but also for advancing society as a whole. And I think this is a very important lesson when we think about how minorities can adjust into majorities, that the thinking has to be big and wide, and a sense of a very strong, broad sense of social responsibility from the minority that extends outwards. So.
I just wanted to add to what Michah said, that I think what Mendelssohn was really trying to do was to establish standards of civility, that toleration was clearly part of that, but civility in the sense of what subjects are really important because they're shared by everyone, and which subjects can remain private and beyond that sphere of discussion. And I think what Mendelssohn says in that response to Lafayette, as Michah points out, is that Mendelssohn understood philosophy to be about shared truths, the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and providence. Because those three ideas for Mendelssohn and for most 18th century thinkers were the foundation of a common morality. I mean, what the Enlightenment, one way of seeing the Enlightenment is to say that what the Enlightenment was really all about was finding a common morality for a religiously plural society, right? From the time of the Reformation, Europe was religiously plural. You had now Catholics, you had Protestants, and the growth of innumerable Protestant sects, all of which were warring with one another, and you had Jews. And the problem for virtually every European country, Prussia was at the forefront of it, was how do you create a common foundation for a religiously plural society? And that's what the Enlightenment was all about. And what how Mendelssohn understood that is that the Enlightenment as a philosophical movement should emphasize those core or foundational ideas which are necessary to all religions in order to have a common morality and a common discourse to undergird society. And, the reality of it for Mendelssohn is that anything he wrote, living in Prussia, this occurred in 1769-70, he had to submit to the censor. And Mendelssohn had a personal privilege to live in Prussia because of his eminence as a philosopher. But that privilege could be revoked at any time. As a matter of fact, when Mendelssohn died, his wife and children had to leave Prussia and reapply in order to have a privilege to live there. Because the first Jews to be naturalized or have citizenship were a few wealthy Jews who gained that privilege in 1790. Mendelssohn died in 1786.
As an editor, I really appreciate Mendelssohn as a writer. I wish I had a Mendelssohn who I could give half the issue to every issue. But also, I think it would be appropriate to end on a characteristic note of Mendelssohn's. So So here's the last few lines of the great book Jerusalem, as translated by our colleague Alan Arkish. And then we'll adjourn and talk Mendelssohnian things over wine and cheese. So, let everyone be permitted to speak as he thinks, to invoke God after his own manner or that of his fathers, and to seek eternal salvation where he thinks he may find it, as long as he does not disturb public felicity and acts honestly toward the civil laws, toward you and his fellow citizens. Let no one in your states be a searcher of hearts and a judge of thoughts. Let no one assume a right that the Omniscient has reserved to himself alone. If we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, then do yourselves render unto God what is God's. Love truth, love peace.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.